Hi guys! So in this video I want to talk a little bit about a Marxist theory of organising. Marx is a writer that's been incredibly influential throughout the world and is often associated with communism or socialism, but actually Marx's theoretical writings were almost all, in fact I think completely all, focused on understanding capitalism. Marx, really simply put, believed that in any era of society there was a social structure or a form to that society which shaped how people organised and was reflected in how people organised, such that although people obviously have some choices and free will, the forms of organising are really dictated by the historical moment in which the organisations exist, not so much the individual choices of managers or leaders or entrepreneurs or chief executives. So Marx's analysis was trying to understand capitalism and how, part of his analysis at least, was trying to understand how capitalism shaped the form of organisations or created what seems like a particular form of organisations as being a natural form. So for Marx, really broadly put, the movement of history was progressive in that it was one in which people gradually moved from oppression to emancipation, from ignorance to knowledge. So he separated history into what he called epochs. You have a slavery epoch, a feudalistic epoch, and the changes in these histories both have theoretical elements to them but also empirical elements. You can just describe them historically. And that's what Marx attempts to do in his book Das Kapital. He tries to understand the form, the underlying principles of capitalism, thinking about where they've come from, the direction they're heading, and how they operate organisationally. That's our purpose anyway. So one of the first things to note is, for Marx, capitalism is actually an improvement on some previous forms of social organisation. One of the main improvements is that in a capitalist society, workers, labourers, people that do stuff, are relatively free. And they're free because they can sell their labour, their ability to make or do things, to other people. In previous epochs, say in slavery, people that did work didn't have that level of freedom. So that's the first point to note. Marx is actually somewhat positive, although a lot of his writing is negative about capitalism. So that's the first thing I think is important to note. Just some general background that's useful for Marx's analysis of organisations. Marx focuses the first part of Das Kapital on understanding consumption or circulation of goods. And here he says there's a general principle in which we circulate commodities. So we could either make something for ourselves, which we need to use, so it has a use value for us. Marx says that's a commodity. Over time, historically, people found that it was easier to make a smaller set of things and specialise in it and then trade and exchange goods. So what happens is you get people trading one commodity for another, one use value for another. Maybe I can make bread and you can make cheese. We swap them together, we can both have cheese sandwiches. As that type of exchange starts to get extended, what you see historically is the emergence of what's called an equivalent, a general equivalent, and that is money. So the principle, the operating principle for Marx of the mode of consumption is you take a use value, a commodity, you exchange it for money, and then you use that money to buy other use values. So I make bread, I sell the bread to people, I have money, I then use that money to buy cheese and I can make cheese sandwiches. So for Marx, this circulation is a way of distributing use values so that we all get cheese sandwiches, we all get some use value. Simple. When we look at the other side, not the mode of circulation, but the mode of production or accumulation, Marx notices something really curious happens. Here we take money and we exchange it for some commodities, and then we can turn it back into money. So he said, people that particularly what he would call capitalists, or people that produce stuff, they have their money and then they transfer that money into physical goods, the means of production, so machinery, factories, facilities and such like. Or they buy other people's labour power, and they then turn those commodities into a new commodity, a thing, an iPhone, a cheese sandwich, which they can then sell on the market. And the money that they get at the end, Marx notes, in capitalism is more than the money they got at the beginning. And so Marx's question is, how does that extra money emerge? Marx calls this extra money surplus value. We could think of it as profit. So this is his question, and he interrogates the mode of accumulation or production. This is where Marx believes profit comes from. This is sometimes called the labour theory of value. So an alternative would be to say you make something and you sell it for more than you made it for. So it's the consumer that pays more. And Marx says, well, that can happen, but ultimately that's just a rip-off. And in a capitalist economy, capitalists will compete with each other on price and say, if I can make something and sell it for a lower price and I'll sell more, I would do that. So there's a natural tendency, Marx said, in capitalism for that not to happen. There's also moral and legal rules in most capitalist societies against that happening, against purely making money off of consumers. So Marx says, no, it can't just be that. It has to be something that happens in that transference of the capitalist buying commodities, either a physical means of production or people's labour, and then transferring it into more money or profit at the end. So Marx wants to say, well, where does that come from? One analysis would be it's an exploitation of individual labourers, that what the capitalist does is he pays people less for their work than they should be paid on the open market. But again, Marx says, well, if that was the case, the labourer who is free to move their labour to different capitalists has a market, so they would also move, so the market should work. The opposite of that would be some kind of slavery where you couldn't leave effectively. So Marx starts to drill down into the capitalist mode of production, say, well, what is it about the way capitalism is organised that means through that production process extra value can somehow emerge? And one of the things that he argues is that whilst individually people are paid their worth by the capitalist, workers are paid their worth, once you put a group of workers together and they begin to cooperate, they create not just their individual value of production, but there's actually some collective value. So, economists would call this economies of scale or scope, but Marx says it's not just an economy in that respect. There's also new social relationships. People are willing to be extra motivated to help each other out. People begin to support each other, and you start to get all of these kinds of cooperations and interactions which aren't produced by any one worker, so no workers being ripped off by not being paid for them, but collectively they create this extra value that the capitalist can keep. So the question where it becomes a moral issue is, well, should the capitalist be able to keep all of that? Because if it doesn't go to the individual worker, because they didn't create it on their own, why should they have it? And this is really where a lot of the debate around Marxism comes from. But what you'll see in our reading for this section is Marx outlines his idea of where this extra value, this profit comes from, simply by allowing individual workers to cooperate as a group. And this, for Marx, is one of the organisational features of capitalism that allows it to work, allows it to generate profit. So that's hopefully an interesting introduction to Marxist organisation theory, and hopefully it's really interesting because a lot of recent commentators believe that cooperation amongst workers, solidarity, commons as it's sometimes called, is a way of getting past capitalism. I'm not so convinced in Marx's chapter on cooperation. That's his argument, but we can talk about that in the comments below. Please like this video.